my pleasure, my honor really, to have our special guest today, Dr. Steven Greer. The show will be aired on September 15th and replayed several times because of the rare importance of this particular show, as it's going to be a briefing for many scientists, pilots, people in all kinds of positions that are related to the UFO issue and various anomalies. And because of the current situation, as this world, many of us know, is approaching a very dangerous border time between life and death, extinction and possibilities. If it wasn't for Dr. Greer, I would not even be talking with you right now, as he and his wife Emily have invited me to the Disclosure Project, where I was exposed to people, experts in all fields related, who knew more than I did and what I do about this UFO issue, most of which I have kept quiet due to what I know Dr. Greer has experienced too, the different threats, discrediting campaigns, and so on. Today we're going to bring out a new kind of truth that's dealing with the insider information about this UFO issue, about what's actually going on, who's doing it, not just at the amateur level, but in the departmental government research and the phenomena of UFOs in general across the entire span around the world. Dr. Greer, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you.
Thank you. No one on the earth has done more than you have that I know of. I know you are famous for having delved into so many areas of the UFO issue. I've received a lot of questions from some people who are interested in causing the pivot that your work has led to, the change that might be possible on this planet if people understood and knew what you do and what you have been experiencing, the people that you've met, the enormous amounts of information that you've collected that I've even seen in your home. And for the sake of the children, and I know you have 4 and 8 grandchildren, and I have close to 500 million orphans now, the way I look at it, with 100 to 200 species of animals disappearing every day. This is really a time of crisis. And so to relate this issue to the leadership, the decision makers, and to the people who might be able to do something about it is what I see this program doing. So I'd like to begin with, what is going on in the USA? This is one of the big questions that's come to me from the international experts. What's actually going on in different departments, in governmental, corporate, entrepreneurial, anywhere where people are really serious about the UFO issue, especially in the United States where we are?
Well, I think that the first thing we have to do is establish there are at least two trajectories that deal with this issue. The government that people mostly think about, we elect or get appointed, they have very little exposure to this issue, if any. Now, we've just come out with a documentary called Unacknowledged, which has been pretty much in the top documentary on iTunes since May, and it's now on Netflix as, I think, in the top 2 or 3 globally. And I recommend people see this as sort of an introduction to the issue. And the name of the film, Unacknowledged, comes from the proper name for Unacknowledged Special Access Projects, or USAPs, that are the super secret projects that are beyond constitutional oversight and control. And we estimate upwards of around $200 billion a year clandestinely are going into these unacknowledged special access projects. And over the last few decades, somewhere around $8.5 trillion have been siphoned off into these operations. Now, to understand the structure of this is really the first step. Otherwise, nothing we're going to say for the next 2 hours is going to make any sense to anybody. So I like to give examples so that people have a very palpable sense of this. And I remember some years ago, before I did the Global Disclosure Project National Press Club that you graciously agreed to attend and provide your testimony, I was asked to brief the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, J2, it would be called in the United States. Now, this was an admiral, Tom Wilson, who had received from us a detailed briefing, an updated version of what I provided to President Bill Clinton and his CIA director, Jim Woolsey. And that briefing actually had a document that I had recently acquired that was from the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, which is the super secret spy satellite entity that has spy satellites up in space, some of which, of course, are movable and can be repositioned. At any rate, this document lists the project code names and numbers for a number of these projects as of 1991. And it came to me from a very good source, and it had the correct numbers on it. So I gave this document in a briefing prior to my meeting personally with astronaut Edgar Mitchell. I brought him as a guest so he could learn about this. He was just really exploring this back in those days. This is 20 years ago. And the admiral, when he got this briefing packet, now keep in mind, this is the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Pentagon. He made inquiries into one of the compartmented operations, and these are top secret TSSCI, top secret special compartmented information, but in an unacknowledged area, meaning that it's not acknowledged as existing to anyone who is not in the system. And when he made this inquiry, he did locate, in fact, the correct compartment, but the people at the other end, who were contractors, corporate, said to him, yes, sir, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know, and we cannot discuss this with you. I'm worked with for many years. Some of these people I've known for 25 years, quarter of a century, who have been in unacknowledged special access projects. The way the secrecy is enforced is so extraordinary. One man told me about one project he was in, and this was a very long time ago, I think in the 80s. And that one project was a $3 billion U.S. dollar project that was unacknowledged. They were taken into a underground SCIF, a secure communication information facility or intelligence facility. They had all of their guns and all of their electronics and watches, everything taken from them. And there was one man who went down who was the security officer for this particular USAP, Unacknowledged Special Access Project. That security officer, when he got all the people in the room working on that particular operation, pulled his magazine out of his gun, pulled a bullet out, and he said, this bullet will find you if you discuss this with anyone not in this room. It doesn't matter if it's your commanding general. It doesn't matter if it's the President of the United States or the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, et cetera, and so on. So the public, and in fact, I would say government officials, both in the United States and elsewhere, need to understand the architecture and the structure of the secrecy. It is not the same as, say, the nuclear launch code or the routine things that, for example, that Snowden exposed in his leaks about the National Security Agency PRISM project. This is orders of magnitude beyond that. Now, I want to add another layer of complexity because I have been talking about unacknowledged special access projects within the government. Those interface very intimately with the top tier government contractors. Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, where they make all the super secret aircraft, Northrop Grumman, some of the Boeing operations, MITRE Corporation, EG&G, E-Systems, Raytheon, et cetera, and so on. Booz Allen Hamilton, what have you. Those operations are also unacknowledged special access projects, but they are also private proprietary corporate projects. And they have a dual level of secrecy because they will then claim that some of what they're working on is work product that is proprietary and therefore cannot be disclosed to people who try to investigate it. I talked to a man who was a Big Four accounting investigator who does audits of government contracts. And he ran into this operation at Northrop Grumman where basically they said, we're not going to tell you anything about what we're actually doing with these funds. Here's what you can report. And he just had to rubber stamp it. So there's really no oversight of this. This is a very complex structure that people have to understand is not your normal appropriations, oversight, et cetera. I can't tell you how many members of Congress, for example, and also leaders in other countries I've spoken to, every person listening on the show would think that they certainly would know about anything this sensitive. And I can assure you they do not. So the first thing you have to get your mind around is from 1945, at the end of World War II, until now, they're evolved. And most of this took place in the 50s, by the way, and 60s. A classification of operations that are literally beyond what most people would think top secret and are in these unacknowledged special access projects. These are facts. This is what we can prove through testimony, and which if you go to our website, which is SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS, like the star system, disclosure.com, there's a link to dozens and dozens of these people's testimony, documents, etc. Now, because of that, people who are in the know, for example, in government or even corporations that I've met with, will frequently tell me, well, I had access to everything but this area, but I knew it was going on. I'll give you an example. I once had a meeting with the former chairman of AT&T and also the man who had been the chairman of Stanford Research International, SRI. They knew that they had operations, contract operations within their organizations dealing with the UFO and extraterrestrial issue, and particularly the technologies. But because even though they were the chairman or CEOs of these, they were not read into it. Read into means briefed. So it's incredibly tightly compartmentalized. It's not the normal top-down structure that you think of when you think of governance in either civilian government, military intelligence, or corporate governance. And I think this is the thing that most people have to first get a reset on their understanding. Then the rest of what I'm going to tell you makes sense. For example, that once we began to study the objects that did come from Roswell that were extraterrestrial in origin, but also many others. And unfortunately, these were extraterrestrial vehicles that were surveilling our nuclear weapons facilities. People forget that the 509th Bomber Squadron in New Mexico there in Roswell was the only nuclear bomber capable squadron on Earth in 1947. We had developed an electromagnetic sort of pulse Tesla-type weapon that was discharged when 3 of these objects flew by, and it disabled them. They crashed. They were surprised, as sort of like a surprise hit, and we retrieved 2 of them eventually. One of them was blown to smithereens. One was more intact. The other one wasn't found for 3 or 4 years until the early 50s in a remote area. And one of the things that people have to understand is that began a research and development effort that dwarfed the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now, how do I know that? Well, if you look at the film and you look at our website, you'll see that from the Canadian government, they, I understand, accidentally declassified a top-secret document that was dated 1951. It's called the Wilbur Smith document. And this man had been asked by the Canadian government to look into what the Americans were doing related to so-called flying saucers. And he looked into it, and he concluded several things. And this is an uncontested, declassified, top-secret document. And in this document, he says, number 1, flying saucers exist. Number 2, a concerted effort headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who had headed up the Manhattan Project to create the atomic bomb, was looking into the, quote, modus operandi, which is the means of propulsion and energy behind these devices. And that number 3, it was the most classified operation in the United States, exceeding the secrecy surrounding the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now, this is a year before we detonated the first H-bomb. And so that document alone will give you a sense of the extreme secrecy that was placed around this issue all the way back to the 40s and early 50s. Now, because of this, this has allowed let's say, a structure to develop over 60, 70 years that has escaped the proper oversight and control of not only the U.S., but also Soviet, now Russian governments, British governments, and others. It is a transnational operation that is incredibly powerful and deals with technologies and assets that dwarf anything that is acknowledged or known to exist at the Pentagon or in the Kremlin. Let me give you one other little vignette that will give people a sense of this. At the end of my meeting with the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Tom Wilson, I asked him if he could help us get this issue under control and get it disclosed so that we could begin to get back on track for our civilization to not only make peace with each other, but with peace with these interstellar civilizations, and also to create peace in space and bring out these energy technologies that would get us off of oil and gas and nuclear power that are destroying the biosphere. And he looked at me, he said, look, I have learned since I got this briefing from you and now through this meeting that there are organizations and operations that have technologies that are beyond anything I can command. The best thing I have, this is what the Admiral said very bluntly, the best thing I have is a B-2 stealth bomber. And these covert operations have man-made UFOs that can do circles around it. He said, so it's point, set, match. The game's over. I can't do anything about it. He says, good luck to you. Now, he also said something else very interestingly. He says, even if I wanted to penetrate those operations and get them under control, I couldn't do so without also becoming unacknowledged and illegal, without the say-so of the Secretary of Defense and the President. He says, but those folks don't want to do this because they're afraid. Sheer intimidation and fear. So that's what I've been dealing with for 25 years. Now, I mean, I know it's a mouthful here in the first 15, 20 minutes of this, but that is the reality. These are the facts. This is not conjecture or some theory. This has been the life I've lived. You know, I left my medical career as an emergency doctor to do this. And so people have to understand this is very real. It is not some theory. And this is actually why the world is so far off the course. I mean, imagine, Carol, if in the 40s and 50s we had made peace with these visitors, but also done what they asked us to do and denuclearize the world. And also then, because we would have a stable and peaceful world, bring out these so-called zero-point energy technologies where there would be free energy and there would be no pollution and no poverty on the planet and no loss of species, everything you talked about at your opening remarks. That wouldn't have happened over the last 60 or 70 years. This has been an avoidable cataclysm. And so what I'm saying is that this is not just a matter of whether we're alone in the universe and other little gray men, et cetera, and so on, and all those usual canards. This is about the future of the human race and the planet Earth. And whether we deal with this properly or not is going to determine our future. And unfortunately, you know, when this problem first evolved, I was not born yet. Because by 1955, when I was born, it was a fait accompli. However, we can make this change happen, but it's going to take a very big effort by a lot of people in the scientific, corporate, financial, government world to understand this issue properly and take some, at this point, extremely forward-leaning and aggressive steps to get us off the brink of extinction, which is where we're headed. So I think this is it's an existential crisis for our planet, for humanity, and it's going to take an enormous effort to get this resolved. And one of the things I always joke is that I'm an emergency and trauma medical doctor, and I know an emergency when I see one. And our planet and our species is definitely in an emergency.
You're touching on so many different subjects that we're going to squeeze into this 2 hours, and I might even consider this to be our part one, because where I want to go with this is we're going to put together an idea during this program of steps that can actually be taken. And that's going to be very interesting because I hear, like you do, from people all over the world who want to solve this problem, knowing that as they get educated, mainly by you and the projects that you've put together, that we have one chance in time, and it's now, before they place weapons in space. Of course, the rumors and the lies are something, too, that I know you cover. But just to give it a piece of body to it a little bit more, when we talk about the reverse engineered projects, and you know that they exist, how do you know that they exist? Of course, most of what we know is from witnesses, which is a new form of proof. The proof in the past has been very different. We have people saying we can't sign a treaty to ban weapons from space because there's no verification or enforcement, which of course there's both. It's based on cooperation and the sharing of information and the fact that that's all that's gone on in space so far, cooperative ventures. But could you give us some examples, for example, of your opinions and what you know about different technological projects that may have been obtained from the basis of the UFO research? For example, one of the questions that came up was about warp drive projects and similar technologies, new ways of obtaining energy, things that you might know about that have come out of those studies.
Well, this is also a very big area of discussion. You really have to go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s because, and I want to be clear on this, there are two pathways that joined with each other in the late 40s and 50s. The first pathway was what was going on with very human scientists who were doing experiments with high voltage electromagnetic systems that would create a vector into the fabric of space-time, what's been called the zero-point energy field, which is the baseline energy field that all of space-time and matter is fluxing in and out of. These experiments, they didn't quite understand the physics, but empirically meaning the actual experimental observations, were such that everyone from Nikola Tesla to T. Townsend Brown, whose work became the foundation of the RAND Corporation, were doing experiments with this. T. Townsend Brown, for example, in the late 1920s, were doing experiments with certain crystalline materials and metallic materials with voltages going in that would cause mass cancellation and things would then levitate. Now, I want to be very clear. This has been popularized as called anti-gravity. It really is an anti-gravity. What it is that it creates a change in the angular momentum at a subatomic level where the mass, which is different from the weight, if you know your physics, the mass of an object reaches and approaches zero. Now, when the mass approaches zero, it becomes lighter than air. The propulsion means that you can, if you understand the formulas for velocity is inversely proportional to the mass. So the lower the mass, the faster something can go. And these experiments were being done in the 1920s. The United States government took an interest in this, and those black projects were going on during the 30s and 40s and World War II. Now, on top of it, in Germany, there were projects that were going forward dealing with this same area. And Hitler's secret weapon he was working on, and I know this for an absolute fact, and we have firsthand testimony about this and documents, was a device that looked like a bell-shaped object or a disc that was man-made, that was able to have amazing propulsion capabilities. That technology did not reach completion by the time we got the atomic weapon and World War II ended. However, it was very interesting. I should tell you that in the last few months, I had a meeting at, of all places, the Watergate Apartments in Washington with the son of Senator John Warner. And Senator John Warner was a very conservative Republican senator who has retired from Virginia. There are battleships named after him, et cetera, and so forth. And Senator Warner was on this committee dealing with these secret operations. He had also at some point been, I think, deputy director or of the Navy or one of the senior Navy officials. And he went into politics. Now, interestingly, his first wife, not Elizabeth Taylor, his first wife was a Mellon, Paul Mellon's daughter. And Paul Mellon of the Mellon fortune, who was his father-in-law, was assigned to deal with this at the end of World War II. Senator John Warner's son, who's around my age, was talking to his grandfather, Paul Mellon, towards the end of his life, and the old fellow had a little bit too much to drink, and he admitted that in 1945, at the end of World War II, he and General George S. Patton and a number of other people went over to Germany and retrieved one of these prototypes, so-called anti-gravity prototypes. That was then brought back in a very secret project, including a lot of the operations dealing with Operation Paperclip, because we wanted to get those out of there before the Soviets got them. And so we brought them over into the United States, and Hermann Oberst and a whole lot of other people who had worked in the project there in Germany were brought over with Operation Paperclip, where the OSS, which became the CIA, put a paperclip on someone's file to say, we're not going to let these go to Nuremberg, we're going to let them come to the U.S., and because they're very accomplished scientists, and they're going to help us with this. Well, interestingly, General George Patton was advocating that this technology could be used for civilian purposes and peaceful purposes. Of all people, George Patton, and he was assassinated because he was advocating its disclosure. That's 1945. So these technologies, which were on a pathway, albeit covert ones, very, very classified, within human research and development, were then augmented tremendously, or let's say they were put on steroids, once we acquired an extraterrestrial interstellar vehicle that we downed outside of Roswell in 1947, 2 years later. You see the trajectory I'm trying to point here. Mm-hmm. So what happened is a very well-organized group, headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, then began to research not only what the Nazis had, but also what had been done in covert human electromagnetic programs. And then that was augmented and greatly assisted by then studying the super advanced technologies they got from one and then more of these interstellar vehicles, which had a energy and propulsion setup that was inscrutable at the time, but that eventually led to, as Colonel Corso admitted, everything from fiber optics to integrated circuits and all sorts of things. The things that were held back and that are still super secret is the energy propulsion system based on zero-point field energy and the electromagnetogravitics, EMGs, which are the so-called anti-gravity part of it. That's still kept very, very secret, top secret, beyond top secret. But it started a whole covert, unacknowledged special access research and development effort that continues to this day. The arc of it goes from that era to right now. And that's what people have to understand. So what I'm saying is, within these classified research and development projects that are both governmental and corporate, we already have the means to get rid of all of our surface roads, get rid of all our coal, oil, nuclear power, solar panels, wind power, all of it's obsolete, and have a completely new civilization on this planet that would be amazing. Within a generation, there would be no poverty, there would be no pollution, we could heal the earth, and we could create a just and lasting civilization. But think about this. You're also going to have to take on the oil oligarchs, the atomic energy. You're going to have to take on all the people dealing with the petrodollar system, which runs the whole financial system of the planet. All of that's going to be made obsolete. So this is not a conspiracy theory. This is a normal and natural outgrowth of centralized macroeconomic power. And when I first brought this up to the Honorable Paul Hellyer, who had been Minister of Defense for Canada, who had confirmed to him by some Air Force generals in the United States that everything I'm telling you right now is absolutely true. He had been trained classically as a macroeconomics expert. And he said, once I explained to him what the implications were of disclosing the fact that we're not alone in the universe and that we already are being visited and that these technologies have been fully, and I mean fully developed within classified projects, he says the secrecy now makes sense because it means that, J.P. Morgan Chase and all the gangbangsters and the people who run the big petrodollar banking empires, as well as every fossil fuel and utility in the world, would have to basically would be replaced. They'd end up like the horse and buggy. It'd be something in a museum. But now we're talking hundreds of trillions, or maybe more than 1,000 trillion dollars in assets. So this is the crux of the problem. It is a massive geophysical and geopolitical and financial crisis that nobody wants to deal with. As one admiral said to us back in the 90s, he says, look, you're absolutely right. This is a mistake that this was ever kept secret, but that's the way it is. And he says, to bring it out would be such a huge change that I and other people like me don't want to deal with it. I just want to retire from this command and go fishing at my ranch in Wyoming. So part of this is a very prosaic story, to be honest with you, Carol, of people not wanting to bite the bullet, deal with this in a courageous and responsible way, and they just kick the can down the road. But by kicking this can down the road, we now have a situation where the biosphere is collapsing, both polar ice caps are disappearing, we have significant climate change, regardless of what those deniers want to say, and we have a world where we have an increasing disparity between the haves and the have-nots, worse than it was before the Great Depression, which can only lead to revolution, terrorism, and unrest because of the injustice of it. So if you want to address all these issues, ironically, what we're discussing, as much as it seems like an outlier, is the crux of the issue. Now, the other technologies that got developed within the corporate so-called WFO, work for other, is what it's called, contracting world in the U.S. and elsewhere, not only has to do with the energy and propulsion systems, but with very advanced transdimensional physics that have to do with communication and systems that are going beyond the speed of light through other dimensions. Because let's back this up. If you're an extraterrestrial civilization from, 2,000 light years away, which is actually quite nearby, it's only 1/50th of the way through our own galaxy. The Milky Way is 2,000 light years, but our galaxy is 100,000 light years across. If you're only dealing with things that go at the speed of light, like this phone you and I are talking on, or light, or what have you, it's going to take you 2,000 years to get a communication signal to your spacecraft around the Earth, another 2,000 years to get it back. Same thing with transportation. It would take 2,000 years at the speed of light to get here, 2,000 years to get back. The speed of light is too damn slow. Now, what that means is where the real action is, and this is the thing where I begin to lose people, the real action is not in the linear free energy or even electromagnetogravitics. It's in the transdimensional physics that drop out of linear space-time, go through other dimensions, and are beyond, way beyond the speed of light, because you're not dealing with linear acceleration. You're dealing with a non-local and non-linear cosmos. And this is where the real action has been over the last 50 years.
Well, that's the most interesting part of this whole thing, because this is the part that's left out of almost all conversations related to the field that, as you know, I've been looking at for so long, cooperation in international cooperation in space, but also to replace the intention to base weapons in space, which obviously would be obsolete when we're talking about off-planet cultures that came such distances with such knowledge. But then where do we go? How do we begin to educate decision makers and the public, of course, the media and the people who need to be not just researching this issue, but how do we educate them about what the possibilities are and what are the possibilities that could lead us to be more attracted to these and to see that a reality exists that we can create that you've begun to describe? How do we begin? What do we put together to make a new, honest, open research and development program show up that could replace the mentality of war, destruction, suffering that's okay in certain circumstances and that is out of control in others?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I have recently put together is a sort of a summary of what I call the New Earth Energy Incubator. And, you know, Google has research and development incubators. Apple does, all the big tech companies. No corporation or government entity is openly doing work in this area that would benefit the Earth and humanity. So what I'm proposing is that for 1/100 of 1% on what we're spending on studying climate change, we could start a research and development operation that within probably 2 years, if you did it correctly, would bring out the first generation of these zero-point energy systems that would replace the fossil fuel and centralized utility systems and begin the healing process on the Earth and also create unbelievable abundance around the planet. Now, my proposal for this, I'll be very clear, is not to do it the way Apple makes their next iPhone, which is all in secrecy and with intellectual property, because we know that people who tried to do that in this issue have had their patents seized or they've been assassinated or what have you. The key thing is that this has to be done as an open source research and development project to benefit humanity. Now, what do I mean by open source? It means that there is no intellectual property secret and there is no patenting. And at the same time, the laboratory, or if it's a multi-centered research effort, which is the best way to go, would be live streamed so that everyone in the world would see the progress being made, and at each step of technological breakthrough, that data is dumped onto the internet so that it cannot be suppressed or sequestered. Now, this is what I'm proposing to do. You need some serious funding to do it, which obviously right now we do not have. But we're putting out a call for that. I could say that probably any minor government agency or even corporation or really high net worth individual could get together with a few of their colleagues and start this project tomorrow. And I'm having meetings with a number of people now to do this. But that's the first thing that needs to happen. And it's a little bit like when you look at the development of what we call the Internet, which the Defense Advanced Research Project Administration, DARPA, actually developed. It was an Al Gore. And interestingly, but when DARPA was doing that, it's now, of course, a very open system, but it has spawned thousands of companies that are worth trillions of dollars by its development. Now, nobody is doing a similar thing with this new energy field, and it needs to happen. Now, I'll say one caveat here. I think the propulsion part of this needs to be left alone for now. And here's why. This is a complex geopolitical discussion, but let's just be adult-like. And if you bring out the anti-gravity propulsion stuff right away, it will be used to replace rockets and missiles. And now you have a weapon delivery system that makes an intercontinental ballistic missile look like a tinker toy. Therefore, I'm suggesting that we focus on stationary energy generation or devices that could be under the hood of your car or what have you that would then get us off oil and gas and coal as the first phase. Later, once the world becomes more peaceful and more stable, then these anti-gravity so-called technologies could be brought forward. I don't think that's what you want to make a run at initially. So that is what we're proposing to do. Now, it's a very heavy lift. Scientifically, it can be done. There's a number of people I know who have worked on these projects and classified projects, and I'm also in possession of a computer disk that has thousands of pages of seized patents over the last decades that a CIA contact provided to our team some years ago. Now, that cache of documents and information, of course, is two-dimensional, and it's digits on a computer disk. But you need a research and development effort to turn those into operational devices, and that's what I'm suggesting that we do. It can't be done for a few $100,000. You're going to need, minimum 10 to 20 million just to start the process, and realistically $50 to $100 million to do a proper research and development project on this. Of course, which is a rounding error of what we've spent on brilliant Pepples and Star Wars and the Strategic Defense Initiative and other boondoggles that we've done over the last 30 years. But what I feel that people have to understand is that this is a message of hope. This is a very achievable goal. But first, people have to know it's possible. They have to know what the science is. But they also have to know what the transnational, and I use this word carefully, not international, transnational security issues are and what the headwinds are. Who is going to resist this? Who's going to try to stop you? And it's a formidable adversary. Let me tell you that. I've run up against this buzzsaw for 25 years. And I know a number of people who have been assassinated trying to do this incorrectly instead of doing it secretively. This needs to be done with the whole world watching, open source, live streamed, and properly scientifically supported and managed. So this is what I'm proposing. I don't think it can really be done any other way because of the realities of if you do this as a secret project or an intellectual property oriented or patenting project. First of all, the patents are going to be seized at the patent office here and in other countries. Secondly, before you get to that step, you're going to get a national security order that's going to force you to stop developing your system. There's a man that I've worked with for a number of years who's down near the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. And in the 1970s, he was a brilliant physicist and engineer who had a trans-dimensional physics laboratory. And he developed one of these energy devices. And here comes, knocking on his door. He had not even applied for a patent yet. People from the national security state, and he was given a national security order that seized all of his documents and equipment, and he was ordered to work with this group or else. And so this has happened globally. It's not like it's just a U.S. problem. These folks do not want these technologies available because it would terminate oil, gas, coal, nuclear power, public utilities, and the existing macroeconomic order. Now, to me, that's a good thing because the current macroeconomic order is running the entire planet into the ground. And it's also, aside from destroying it geophysically, it's also creating this enormous disparity between wealth and poverty that can only lead to social unrest. So this is something that has to happen, but people have to have their eyes wide open. You have to do it correctly. You have to understand strategically what you're facing in terms of resistance and the kind of tactics that will be used against you. But it's doable. It is doable. It has to be doable. But that's what I'm recommending. Now, the shortest pathway to this would be for someone within these current operations to defect with one of these systems, which is what I've asked for. But unfortunately, when that's happened, I know some years ago, the former CIA director, Bill Colby, was going to defect from this covert operations group with around $50 million in initial funding for us and one of these operational devices, and they found him floating down the Potomac River. His family thought it was a suicide or an accident, but it absolutely was not. He was assassinated. And so I think that you can't do this secretively and you can't do it in a small way. It's one of these things where it's either out of the box or it's in the box. And that's what I think we have to come together. We have to not just study the problem, we have to solve the problem. And I think the problem is eminently solvable, but it can't be, as Einstein said, you can't fix you can't fix a problem from the level of consciousness that created it.
And with that, do you think that this could even be done in the United States? Do you think perhaps an international body of some sort put together the way you're describing might work a little bit better?
I think it could be done anywhere. I think it should be, however, a multi-centered operation. But let me tell you, the resistance you would receive in the United States from authorities would be the same that you would meet in covert interests in Russia or Saudi Arabia or Nigeria or Aruba. The group that wants to keep this stuff quiet is not limited to the United States. This is the other mistake people have made. Let me give you a great example of this, if we have time. I don't know if we have time for me to get into this case.
Go ahead.
So this is recent. So a few years ago, one of the divisions of my project is called the Orion Project, which is looking into these energy systems and trying to disclose them and educate the public. We were going to acquire Stan Meyer, his whole, archive, and all of the technologies he had developed up to the time of his death. Now, one of the things that most people know him for is that he had a car running on water because it had an electrolyzer that had an over-unity or free energy component to it due to the physics behind it. Now, his heirs wanted him to make a quick buck. And my group we only had a few $100,000. We didn't have much. And so an engineering group out of Michigan acquired the entire collection. Now, when we went and visited the warehouse where all of this was stored, it was quite clear to us that the car running on water was the least of it. He had a toroidal shape, a donut-shaped device that was a zero-point energy device that had a national security order slapped on it. I guess it had been in the 80s or early 90s, that he had developed and was fully operational. And it was made very clear to us that if we could get this operating, which we certainly could, that would be the crown jewel of that collection. Well, to make a long story short, we were not able to outbid the engineering group in Michigan that acquired this. They were really interested in going on the normal, conventional technology route. Keep it secret, try to patent it, don't let anyone know where we are, blah, 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 blah. And I said publicly on the radio with millions of people listening, I said, those are all dead men walking. Mm-hmm. Fast forward a couple years later, I get a call from Lord, I can say who it is, so-and-so out of the British Isles, who had been the secret funder of this group, and he said, Dr. Greer, we need your help. I said, what has happened? He says, well, they're being threatened. They've gotten the systems operational. They're thinking they can go to an eco-friendly country. I said, they can't go to Mars and get away from the people who are going to want to kill them. He said, well, what do we do? So I wrote a 4-page strategic paper, what they need to do immediately to get this technology out to the public, open source it, and dump it onto the internet and get about a dozen of these systems built up and put in the correct hands, scientific hands, universities. They wouldn't do it. Last year, about a year and a half ago, I was at a meeting with the CEO of an energy company who knew about this whole story. And he had met one of the survivors of this engineering team and company, a grown man who broke down in tears crying like a baby because all those people had been assassinated. Now, that's just one recent case I've been involved with. So we know that if you do this incorrectly, you're not going to succeed. There's a very narrow window of how to bring these technologies out, and it is not doing it with, like Gollum, my precious ring, my precious ring. This greed stuff is not the way to do it. It has to be open source. It has to be live streamed. It has to have millions of people aware of it, and it has to be dumped into the public domain immediately, in real time, with no holdback. Now, the problem is most people who fund technology efforts, they're wanting to get a proprietary, private bump out of it because, frankly, you see, they're money whores. They're not interested in the planet or the human race. So we have to find someone who's not a misanthropic money whore who wants to support this and follow a strategy that will succeed. Now, is it possible that this could be done in 18 months or 2 years? Absolutely. But you have to get the right team together, and you have to get the right funding, and you have to have the correct strategic plan. And the last part of it is the hardest. The strategic plan, which is what I would try to advise. I mean, I'm certainly not pretending to be an electrical engineer. It is exactly what they need to get right. Because if they don't get that right, you can have all the money in the world and all the technology in the world, it's going to vanish. So you have to know, if you don't learn from the past, you're going to repeat it. And I have said over and over again that this has been the big problem. Everyone starts out on this path. They learn about it. They go, wow, this is amazing. And then they make all the same errors that people have made for 80, 90 years, all the way back to the time of Nikola Tesla. So I think this is why we have to look at this and do it right and get it right this time.
We're going to talk in the next segment about different illustrations, specific things that have already happened that due to the recent contacts with UFOs. We're going to talk about that a bit too. And also, I can envision what you're describing, Steve, because the timing is so perfect. I personally am not interested in the history. I'm interested in what exists now, what the proofs are, who we can bring in specifically to form around the concepts that you're describing so that we can override the evil alien, the aggressive alien scenario that I testified thanks to you in the Disclosure Project about Von Braun's warning. All of the steps of which he described have come true, so far. So we're not really winning. I think it's because we're dealing with it, as you say, in a very old context that's earth-bound. We're literally bound by earth concepts and how to do things. What I hear you describing is something much higher that deals even more with the higher laws of the universe, if we can define that too. When we talk about this, are there any leaders that you see, decision makers in countries, that might host such a meeting, an organization that could be formed?
I have met with some leaders who have expressed interest, but who then don't have the courage. Let me talk about what really is required here and just cut through all the
we're going
nonsense.
to have to do that in the next segment because it's very important. It's dealing, I think, too, with the threats that we're all under to not come forward. We're going to take a very quick 4-minute break. Stay with us. We have another packed hour coming up. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the world's meeting place. American.
It's practically narcotics.
Freedom.
Oh, yes, I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Welcome back to the Carol Rosin Show with Dr. Steven Greer. Steven, I have a question coming in from the international groups that want to know, what do you think are the best illustrations of recent contact that people could use to talk about to show that we are, in fact, in contact? Some of us are from private. I haven't certainly gone public with my experiences. I know many of us haven't for obvious reasons. But what do you know to be, or what do you think are the best illustrations of recent contact?
Well, I think there's no question the best illustrations of that are to be found in the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind Initiative, which was the initial operation I started in 1990. And we have now tens of thousands of people around the world using a set of protocols to make contact. We demonstrated these for the French government back a few years ago, and had objects that came over, were tracked on radar at 200,000 kilometers an hour, as well as objects that were in the field with us, and beams that were in the field with us. And if you go on our website, you'll see that a few years ago in Joshua Tree, there was an interstellar ambassador that materialized in a cone of light that had come in from space, hovering right outside our circle. So that is by far the best evidence, and it's an ongoing project. In fact, the next documentary I'm going to do is about that. But now, to get your mind around it, you have to understand the reality of an interstellar civilization. And I'm going to say something here very controversial, but it's checkable. All interstellar civilizations are transdimensional, meaning they do not go from one star system to another, staying in a linear material form. They go through other dimensions and so-called dematerialize, rematerialize in another point in space-time. Physics behind this we do understand. We also understand that there is a science behind it that deals with non-locality in physics, what Einstein called the spooky theory, where you would observe, for example, the same particle in two places at once. But also non-locality in mind or consciousness, where the mind itself becomes a non-local field for both communication and experience. So this gets into the really deep end of the pond that I think is a big part of the secrecy as well. They want people to remain in a state of ignorance, of sort of reductionistic, materialistic nonsense. And the solution isn't going to come from that understanding of reality. It's going to come from a much higher level of consciousness and knowledge.
And because of the experiences that millions of people have had, where they've had, for example, an ET come in through the wall, how then would you explain that so that people can have a language for it?
It's all based on the resonant frequency, the field frequency of, let's give an example. This happened, we have a videotape of this. This happened a few months ago on a mountaintop in Arizona. So we had a team of people I was training. There were about 30 people there. We set up the first line. I walk into the circle. 4 interstellar objects materialized in the sky at dusk. Bink, 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 lined up. They're fully there, visible. Everyone saw them. They then dematerialized in front of everyone. We have this on videotape, by the way. Now, what's interesting about it is that people are going, what the hell just happened? And I said, these civilizations are not necessarily in our atmosphere in a fully formed material form unless they want to be. They can be in these other forms that are more like plasma, energy, so what used to be called etheric, but also energy fields that are visible. Now, it can go from that into a full 3D physical object that you could, kick the tires of it if it had tires. Of course, they don't have tires. And I think this science of understanding, the understanding of the physics behind how you get a biological organism, a physical spacecraft, to move from one point of the cosmos to another at multiples of the speed of light, many multiples of the speed of light. That is the really interesting science. The free energy stuff and the 0 point and even the normal anti-gravity, that's 40s and 50s. The stuff I'm talking about now is now. This is what's really amazing. But unfortunately, most people don't even know we have 0 point energy and anti-gravity systems. So it's what I'm trying to do with these documentaries we're doing and all my YouTube presentations is to bring people along, because unfortunately the public has been miseducated deliberately for 70 years. And they've also been disinformed with the whole good alien, bad alien, fake, everything's fake. So what most people don't understand, and this is one of the things we bring out in the movie, we have an Air Force intelligence officer saying on the record that the U.S. paramilitary operations that are unacknowledged have hoaxed events that look like alien, but that are man-made to scare the hell out of people, including abductions, and including tests of our own man-made propulsion systems that have gone wrong and killed people and claim the aliens did it. Let me give you one example that didn't make it into the movie Unacknowledged, but it's in my book. So everyone needs to get this book. Everyone. It's at Barnes & Noble. It's at Amazon. It's at our website. If you read, of course, most people don't read anymore. They look at 142-character Twitter feeds and 3-minute YouTube videos of kitty cats playing the piano. But be that as it may, if you're literate, this is the book you want to get. It's called Unacknowledged, just like the movie. And in this book, there is part of the testimony from this Air Force intelligence officer was about the Cash Landrum case, where in the early 1980s, we were test flying. It was an ET craft that we couldn't get the propulsion system to work. We replaced it with a nuclear-powered energy system. It had some kind of core breach with a pump or filter problem. It started outgassing horrible radioactive waste outside in Texas, in suburbs outside Houston, and it radiated these two people, Cash and Landrum. They had to be hospitalized. They eventually died. They were actually tried to sue the government because this this prototype UFO being piloted by humans went out of control. It was being escorted down by military helicopters to an air base in Texas, and it caused serious injury to the people underneath this thing. Now, the intelligence community and the military were very happy for the UFO subculture to say, oh, well, the aliens killed these poor innocent people. It wasn't aliens. It was a man-made prototype that went bad, and they allowed the word to go out that it was a quote-unquote UFO. And what I point out to people is that there are two categories of UFOs, the ones that are made by covert aerospace and research projects and the ones that are interstellar. Most people don't know there are two different categories, and so they think everything that happens out there is extraterrestrial when it is not. And they're very happy for people not to be disabused of that illusion or delusion. Now you add to that an active disinformation campaign where they have these man-made anti-gravity devices with creatures that look like ETs, but that are completely man-made. It's called stagecraft. And those go around and abduct people using various chemicals and other things and electronic warfare systems. And then those people say, oh, I was attacked and whatever and molested by an alien. Well, they were attacked and molested by something, but it was run out of a covert operation out of, one of the Desert West facilities. And this is actually, the truth about this is more bizarre than the fiction people believe. And when I first discovered this about 25 years ago, I couldn't believe it. But when I confirmed it from multiple sources, finally we have an Air Force intelligence officer going on the record that, in fact, we have done this. Now, what that means is that there's been a 60-year-plus program of psychological warfare to convince people there's a threat from outer space so that the next big thing they can spring on the public that we all need to unite around is a threat from outer space, the so-called alien threat, which is a complete hoax, 100% fake. Now, the reason that's important is that, it's Leon Panetta, the CIA director, when I provided the briefing for him and Obama on this issue, he said, look, we're spending $110 billion a year in Afghanistan chasing 70 Al-Qaeda people over in Afghanistan. It's ridiculous. So in order to justify the trillions being spent in the military, industrial, laboratory, financial research complex, you have to have a bigger and bigger enemy. Well, the biggest enemy of all, as Werner von Braun, of course, told you, would be to concoct and hoax a threat from outer space. Now, the extent to which this psychological warfare program has been developed, people say, well, when is this hoax going to happen? I said it started happening in the 50s and 60s. And by 1954, we had mastered gravity control. A senior official at the Naval Research Labs, the largest defense lab in the world for the U.S., told me personally that he was in, quote, the vault. His name is Richard Foch, F-O-C-H. He's passed away. I can use his name now. And he was in the vault and saw the document that established that in October of 1954, to do the math, that's 63 years ago, next month, we had mastered gravity control. Those man-made UFO-looking objects have been used for all kinds of psychological warfare purposes and have successfully convinced the public, most of the people who look into this issue, who just don't analyze it properly, that there's some threat from outer space. Now, to what end? Because eventually, it's sort of like the movie Independence Day, where, Will Smith go, let's go kick alien butt and all this stuff. They want to unite the world, not around peace and cooperation in space and cooperation amongst the stars. They want to unite the people of the world around a military junta that would convince people there's a threat that would then redound to the benefit of the same vicious psychopaths who are running the system today, the global elite and oligarchs who want to see endless war happen. So I think that people have to wake up to the fact that we're being manipulated into this rubbish, and that there are extraordinary technologies that exist in these classified, unacknowledged special access projects that can successfully hoax an attack on our planet and make it look like the ETs did it when it was completely run out of an underground base out of Provo, Utah, or Nevada or someplace.
And as you know, and you've talked about, this manipulation's been taking place even by people with credentials who are coming out with the most absurd stories. I want to ask if they believe in Santa Claus, but actually I think they do believe what they're saying because of this technology that perhaps is manipulating their minds. And you've touched on that a bit, not in this interview, but I've heard you talk about it many times. But okay, say now we're beginning to educate people. And by the way, feel free to go in and talk about the things that I've heard from tens of thousands of people about Corey Goode and Tompkins, and I'm sorry to mention names because I didn't want to do that, but people who are coming out with the most considerably absurd stories of where their life has gone and what's going on, and it leads to many people's scenarios in the exopolitics, ufology, conspiracy theory, secret space program events about the evil aliens coming. And then how do we deal with that? Because now that we know the minds are being manipulated, then what?
Well, I think, it's the old thing is, sunlight is the best disinfectant. You have to have more people like Air Force Intelligence Officer Doty come forward and say, yes, we have hoaxed these abductions. Yes, we have had events happen that are man-made, UFO-looking objects that we then allow people to think is ET. But we need more people to come forward and expose this charade. Now, let me say one thing. I think there are a lot of people who have been in projects and also not in projects who have been victims of these operations, who believe and take at face value the experiences they've had. Because I remember back in about 1993, I met with a man who had developed a technology that was an electromagnetic system that interfaced with people's thought and consciousness and brain, and not from a remote location. And he told me, now this was developed in 1956. So, I was 1 year old. Now, he told me, he said, these systems are so good that we can target someone it's almost like an electronic LSD where they can program the hallucination, where we can give them any experience and they will believe it's real. And I'm going to quote here. He said, if we want you to have a private conversation with your personal God, Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, whoever it is, you'll believe you had it, you'll think it's real, and you will pass a lie detector that it's real. Now, when I first heard that, I thought, what in the world is he talking about? And I started drilling down on this. And this is the deep, very deep end of the covert programs that deal with let's say, the dark use of these incredible science and physics that deal with electromagnetic systems that interface with consciousness and thought. So those systems are not, again, a conspiracy theory. There's an enormous amount of documentation on it, but it's been used to pull the wool over the eyes of people and deceive them. Then you have other operations. One of the people, when I first had, before we did the 2001 National Press Club event that was seen by hundreds of millions of people around the world, that you were part of, I had a series of briefings for Congress and also Pentagon people in 1997. And one of those gatherings where we invited members of Congress to come, and there were chairmen of committees and what have you, it was a private gathering. One of the people who came was on an interagency committee in 1974 that and had everything in place. And he said, we can hit a button, and events will begin to unfold that will look like an alien invasion. We're running the whole thing, and it will fool everyone from the president on down because they have no idea it's possible. And it's using extraordinary technologies they've been sitting on for decades. Now, this man, at about 2 a.m, had some people that he had worked with in these covert programs show up at the Westin Hotel in Georgetown, where we were holding these meetings, who begged him not to testify to this, and they took him out to an underground facility out in Virginia until the briefings the next day for members of Congress were completed. Now, the people who, my military advisor, Edgar Mitchell, and other people saw this man, they never knew quite what he was going to testify to. They just knew he disappeared. I'm telling you now what happened, because I'm the head of the project. So this is the kind of thing, and we need people to come forward and be whistleblowers on this hoax and this sort of effort to convince people of a threat which is absolutely non-existent. The other thing we have to do, instead of just dealing with rhetoric, we also have to deal with rational thought. And I want to just back this up a little bit to if there are any scientists listening to this, think about this, meditate on what I'm about to say. Let's say that you're a civilization and you're, 10 to the 6th to 10 to the 7th years or more advanced than we are, 100,000 to millions of years more developed. You come across this planet that's beginning to blow themselves up with thermonuclear weapons. And maybe you've been observing this planet for millennia, if not millions of years. Now, the technologies you have to be able to go interstellar are such that if you wanted to terminate that civilization, you could do so in a nanosecond. You wouldn't have to be dragging people out of their bedrooms and taking their eggs interstellar, or such that if they were of a hostile nature, if they hadn't already attained peace in their world and a peaceful consciousness, they would have blown each other up long before they found us. And so, from a rational point of view, if you just look at the science behind interstellar travel, those civilizations, if they were really hostile to us, they could have just completely shut this whole game down about the time we detonated the first atomic bomb at the Trinity site in New Mexico. They haven't, because they're waiting for us to get this right, become peaceful, and join an interplanetary civilization coalition. Now, that's something they can impose. It's like us imposing on the warlords of Afghanistan Jeffersonian democracy. It's ridiculous. We as humans have to come around to this new enlightenment, let's call it, ourselves. And I think that is what they're waiting for us to do. In the meanwhile, they have checks and balances in place in case we do try to, in a terrible misadventure, project our own violence and dysfunction into their corner of the cosmos. And that will then result in the systems being shut down, the human systems being shut down. That would be trying to do that. And that is one of the reasons they're here, is that we are viewed. I'm going to put the shoe on the other foot here. Let's look at Earth from the eyes of an extraterrestrial civilization. And, in the last century, we've killed a couple 100 million of our own people in warfare and murder. We have thousands of nuclear weapons. Now we have North Korea with them. We have an environment that's collapsing, even though covert programs have the solutions in behavior. It doesn't mean that they're hostile to us, but they may be very concerned about, frankly, the just stupidity and misery being held up to us. We need to look at our own hostility, not worry about the ET hostility. Because if they were hostile, baby, it'd be over. It'd be long over. It'd be point, set, match, done. But I think that we have to begin to look at this. How does humanity look to these other civilizations, given how we are behaving? And I think that they see the majority of the human race as not at all malevolent, but the prevailing power structure of nationalism, of militarism, of aggression, of the first use of technology being used for warfare as a highly dysfunctional and as an existential threat to life on Earth, but potentially to other planets in the cosmos. Because I want to remind people of something that the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, the super secret research and development aerospace project of Lockheed Martin, the biggest contractor for the U.S. government, Ben Rich said, and I have witnesses to him saying this, and this is in our movie Unacknowledged and in the book more extensively. He said, we already have the means to take ET home, meaning we have developed transdimensional systems that can be projecting out there in space. Now, we're not allowed to because there's a quarantine around the Earth. That's another whole discussion. But I think that we have the entry ticket to going out in space, frankly, is that for a peaceful civilization, and we're not there yet. But he made this very clear. I also have a handwritten note where Ben Rich says that there are both extraterrestrial and man-made UFOs in his handwriting. Now, this is the kind of fact and evidence that's in my book, And in this documentary, people need to see. All the people who are asking these questions from other countries, Carol, need to look at this stuff. Because it's not like I haven't spent 25 years and $12 million of my own money trying to put this together on a silver platter for people. And the problem is everybody wants to be spoon-fed. People actually need to take a little time and, take 1/10 of the time you spend looking at Kim Kardashian's last boob job to actually look at the movie and read the book. And that's what I tell people. And then go to the website and drill down on all the references we have. It's all sitting there for people, if the people know how to read. But
everyone has got to do that, and they've got to go to your website, too, SiriusDisclosure.com, and get the books. I also want to recommend not only your Acknowledged book, but the Disclosure Project book, because it has some amazing testimonies in it, that including my favorite, John Callahan, who was in Federal Aviation Administration and has tapes and documents that prove an ET craft, a UFO craft, we'll call it for now, was following an airline for 30 minutes. There's a whole story around this. There's actual physical proof of these things in your work. Now, you mentioned...
we have all that, and we also have the original radar tapes. I personally have those original radar tapes.
Wow. I don't want to skip over the part about the quarantine that you mentioned that's around Earth, but I will drop in here that in my own contact, what I've been told is if we do continue on this nuclear path and set off a nuclear bomb, if we do base weapons in space, which the lie is that they're already there, but they're not. If we continue with this and we already are in the extinction process, my messages have been that they will leave. So I'm interested to hear what you have about the quarantine around the Earth. But also, I want to add right in here, have you or anyone that you know met with President Trump about this, or anyone in his stable? Because so far, we just see, I voted for him because he said that he could get along with the Russians, and I've been to Russia over 30 times, and I will be going back, and at some point. And I've been to China, and they have a treaty to ban all space-based weapons that's mostly ignored, even by peace activists.
Okay, let's talk about that. Let's go into some depth on this. The answer to your question is yes.
Good.
There's someone who is a delegate at the Republican National Committee that's a close member of my team who personally handed to President Trump after he was nominated a very thorough briefing on this. Now, I do not know to the extent to which Mr. Trump has perused or read the material, but he's certainly aware of the issue. And that's number one. This is what I do, and I have to do it, and I do it all the time. Number two, let's talk about the projection of power transdimensionally. In the 1970s, a man that I got to know in the 90s before he died, this man had an electronic company, very well regarded. A member of his board was my military advisor for a number of years. He had developed what are called neutrino light detectors. These were detectors that you can, that were sensitive enough to pick up an extraterrestrial vehicle when it was coming out of, let's call it hyperdimensional space into 3D space-time here. Because when it's stepping down from that higher frequency and resonance from a higher dimension into linear space-time 3D solid matter, at that instant there's a burst of energy that is called neutrino light that is released. Now, these detectors that he developed were seized by the National Security orders on behalf of the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, that runs all the super secret satellites. So these satellites that we have up in space have these neutrino light detectors on them, to wit, when an ET craft approaches the Earth or appears in the atmosphere of the Earth, it is picked up instantly by these detectors. They then relay that information to ground-based scalar electromagnetic systems that are at multiples of the speed of light, as well as directional EMP weapons that then track and target that ET craft and blow it up or try to knock it out of the sky. This is not a conspiracy theory. I have multiple people who've run these operations, seen them in operation, and they've been operational for a long time. Now, what they did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was nothing, because once they got these neutrino light detectors on satellites up in space, their ability to pick up these objects increased exponentially. So this is a crisis happening right now that the United Nations, Russia, the United States government, as you and I think of it, are not dealing with. But these projects are going on. I will remember a naval intelligence officer coming up to me at the end of one of my lectures many years ago, and he hung back at the back of the room. It's always curious to see who hangs out for like 2 hours till the crowd clears out and I get free. And he came up to me. He said, I was on a project where we were targeting these ET objects back in the 70s. He says, you don't know how right you are, that we have the ability to do this. He says, and I asked him, I said, why are we doing this? He says, well, basically, it's a stupid pissing contest. Our view is, this is our planet. You can't be here. If you appear, we're going to knock you down. And it's just that stupid. It's that crass. It's that boorish. So it was this man with impeccable credentials. And he and I had a long discussion about this. And this was back in the 90s. And what I learned was that, the sort of attempts to do this, Lynn Stringfield wrote a whole series of monographs called The Crash Retrieval Syndrome, of all these reports of ET craft crashing. What he never exposed was what were the technologies that were in existence in the 40s, 50s, 60s that permitted this, but what is extant now? What is in existence right now that are the super high-tech systems that are transdimensional, that do pick up on this subtle energy as these craft come into our space-time? And what are the consequences of us doing this with an unelected, unappointed, non-supervised group of nutjobs who are doing this, who I think are endangering all of life on Earth? Now, hearing what I just said, you can imagine the level of enlightened restraint that these ET civilizations have exercised, because if they were overtly violent or hostile, they would have hit back hard, and we would all know about it. They have not. Now, I think it was interesting. When I was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where the original Roswell materials were sent in the 40s, I was meeting with a colonel and an intelligence officer there. And Colonel Canola and this Bruce Ashcroft, the intelligence officer, who was posing as a public information officer, they always do, don't they? And they asked me this question. The colonel said, Dr. Greer, what if these civilizations are hostile? I said, if they were hostile in the way we think of it, you and I would not be breathing the free air of Earth today, because given the galactically stupid things we've been doing, that I know we've been doing, that I can document we've been doing, they would have shut us down a long time ago. So I said that the fact is there's been enormous restraint shown, but the more this situation goes forward, unsupervised and unchecked but the subject being properly disclosed, and by, let's say, our wise elders being brought into the supervision and control of this is very dangerous. And I have always said, power abhors a vacuum. And in the absence of any real leadership I have dealt with U.S. presidents since Bill Clinton in 1993, and I have not seen any leadership out of any country, whether it be Russia, U.S., Great Britain, the United Nations, or anywhere. And believe me, I have met with people who are incredibly interested in this and know what's going on. They don't want to stick their necks out. And they don't want to. So what I want to get back to is what I started on a few minutes ago. The indispensable thing needed is courage, but collective courage. We need to get people together who have the courage to disclose this information and then take constructive action, both to develop the technologies, but to also develop peaceful relations with these civilizations and cooperation in space, and to stand down all these weapons that have been developed. The weapons people are talking about, everyone's always fighting the last war, and that's the nuclear weapons. Those are terrible. I'm talking about a whole generation of weapons that aren't even talked about on CNN or the New York Times or anywhere else that exist, and they're being actively used against interstellar civilizations, spacecraft. So I think we have to catch up. We're way behind the curve on this, Carol, way behind the curve. And so the people who have an interest in this internationally and domestically need to understand that there is a very steep learning curve, and then we need to develop a plan of action.
These are perfect steps, and I remember when I testified before the U.S. Senate, Senator Pell said we never give more than 3 steps to anyone and talk below a 9th grade level so that everyone can understand and it can be translated. And what you've presented now is just so simple. I have a quick question related to these 3 steps you just mentioned. One, we mentioned some of the technologies that we need. Maybe we could just very briefly list the main ones. You mentioned the relations with ETs. There is contact being made by, of course, millions of people in different ways. How would you formulate that to happen? And third, to stand down the weapons. For me, that's easy. Russia and China came up with the treaty. Other countries have already agreed to signing it. We have not been able to, so far, reach the U.S. government. How can we deal with standing down on the weapons? There is a written document that even includes acknowledgement of not only indigenous cultures, but cosmic cultures in it, that's been approved and read worldwide by experts, but it's kind of ignored in the conversations. So those 3 points, if you would, develop the technologies, relations with ETs, and the stand down of the weapons when there are so many people talking about the aggressive, evil aliens. And are there specific people that we could be listening to along with you?
Well, the first point is what we talked about earlier, that the technology, the first level of technology that has to come out is the replacement system for the current energy and power grid. It really doesn't matter if we have a person in space, if we destroy our home planet, if we destroy our nest. And that's what we're doing with the current paradigm. And I want to point out to people that the current paradigm of energy generation is from the 1800s. Even atomic power, nuclear power plants, is from the mid-1940s. So there has 70 to 100 years, I call this in my book and in the movie, Unacknowledged, the lost century. There's a lost century. So we need to walk before we levitate. So the first thing we need to do is bring out these very clean, free energy, 0-point energy generation systems that can run your house, business, village, car, etc. So that's what we need to do. That needs to happen immediately, and we're really running out of time to do it. And the reason I say that, I'm not saying this to be apocalyptic, is that if you look at how long it takes to change 1 billion motor vehicles on the road, and every home and business and factory running on a fossil fuel or atomic power grid that's very poisonous, that is not going to happen in a year or two. That's a 15 or 20 year transition, and we barely have that much time left. So it has to happen soon. Number 2, this issue about contact. Now, what the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative is a global prototype of citizens diplomacy, sort of like the Physicians for Social Responsibility who went over to the Soviet Union from America in the darkest days of the Cold War to create communication and peace and what have you. What we've done is create a global citizens initiative that can be a prototype for other governments. And as I mentioned, the government of Nicolas Sarkozy, Admiral Moran, who is in their Ministry of Defense, asked us to come over and demonstrate this for the French government back in, I believe it was 2010 or 2011, around then. And they have I have an amazing document where they express great interest in continuing this for peaceful purposes. We need to get the United Nations and all the nations of the world educated on contact and communication, and have our wise elders have an ambassador project that bypasses this dark, covert world, making contact with these civilizations. In the meanwhile, the average citizen can organize into teams. And so we have an app on our website that will connect you to other people in your area who want to do this. And we also have a training app on our website. So all the tools are there on our website at SiriusDisclosure.com. Now, the third thing that you were asking about in terms of the weapons in space, we have to understand that in order to get to that point, we first have to, the public has to understand, our leaders have to understand what the big picture is that is at stake here. It isn't just, gee, can we have hegemony over this country or that, or it's really about the fact that we're not alone in the universe. That changes this equation completely. And moreover, there is an unbelievably beautiful future that is right at the threshold of emerging, that is not only world peace, but universal peace in higher consciousness and in what have you, that is waiting to be developed. But it has to happen where we first establish the mechanism for international peace, not only on this planet, but in space. And it has to happen in a way where it takes into account the fact that we're not alone out there. It's not like we're sitting here in some far corner of the universe and there aren't other civilizations that are acutely aware of our presence. So that has to get factored into any of these policy discussions. And I think if it's done in a way that's not xenophobic and isn't based on all this, fake alien threat and hoaxing that goes on, I think that we can get to a point where people will say, look, this is a millennial and multi-generational change that needs to happen, and we need people who are going to have the courage to put that together. And I think we have to identify the people who will. The problem is, and this gets back to another point that's in the book and in the movie Unacknowledged, we have people in that documentary and in the book that confirm, who have been in the intelligence community or have Air Force officers. For example, the Air Force officer who speaks to this says that the media has been given bags of cash, I'm quoting, to basically make up lies about this or to not cover the story or to do what the intelligence community wants them to do. So the IC, or the intelligence community, have people who are embedded in all the major media networks. This gets into why, programs like your own are so important. But, and this is in the movie, and people, when they see it, they go, my God, the free press and the media around the world is completely been corrupted. It has been completely corrupted. Now, another proof of that is the fact that Unacknowledged was like the #1 movie on iTunes for months. It's now at the top of Netflix worldwide with 108 million subscribers to Netflix. Do you know not a single major mainstream media entity will run a story about this movie and book? It's been blacklisted. Now, that is proof in and of itself, not only the corruption of the media, but the extent we need people to virally push this information out. And I think everyone listening needs to go, wow, you can't count on ABC or CNN to do it, or the New York Times, and you can't necessarily count on our government. So let's make this move where we, the people, do this. We do disclosure, we put the funding together for the technology development, and we go out and we make peaceful contact within the construct of universal peace and cooperation that we have in the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, and that's what we take responsibility for. So the people listening need to understand that they need to get out from in front of their TVs and computers and smartphones looking at rubbish and get out there and do something, because it's going to take activism and commitment by a lot of people to make this thing turn around.
I stopped giving speeches 3.5 years ago, Stephen, when I did one at the Secret Space Program, one of those events. It made me so physically ill to hear the stories that were going around that were miseducating, disinforming people. I don't know whether it's from the infiltration or that people prefer the fiction over the truth and the facts, the kind of things that you're talking about. But what I hear you saying is to form clusters, form teams of people, go out and educate the media. There may be local decision makers as well as national and international. Where do we start now? I think we start with looking at your website, that's for sure, and getting the books and videos that you've recommended. But what else do you say that we could do? Because especially with President Trump, who has surrounded himself with people who are dealing in a very earthbound, as I see it, way, coming out of being a corporate manager in an aerospace company, I see that complex has kind of grabbed him. He is a negotiator. He is a businessman. This is about money, following the money. How do you relate to that system?
Well, I think that one of the arguments that has to be made by people who know him, and also I think the average person out there can educate their friends, family, coworkers on this issue. It's all about, all politics end up being local. So, it has to be this grassroots effort. At a higher level of government, we need people to explain that the kind of growth you would see in the global economy that would result from an entirely new and free energy system that would liberate the 48% of the world's population that doesn't even have indoor plumbing, that there would be this economic boom all over the world that would be based on clean energy and free energy and abundance as opposed to scarcity, in living in harmony with the ecosystem, but also with abundance for everyone on the planet, that the kind of economic growth that would attend that would make the juggernaut we've seen in China over the last 20 years look like nothing. And so if you're interested in jobs and the economy or the environment, whatever it is, this is the catalytic thing that will change it. Now, I also think people need to go out and network to us, folks who are willing to walk the walk here. I mean, there are millions of deca and centimillionaires and now thousands of billionaires out there. Much of the money they're putting into philanthropy is utterly wasted, particularly as it pertains to energy and the environment. They're going down a rabbit hole, or really the toilet, frankly. We need to find people who are willing to come together and put serious research and development funding into these technologies. The other thing we need is people, as you said, forming their own clusters and teams in their own community. We have thousands of people on our contact teams around the world who are now hosting at their libraries and their civic groups or at their churches screenings of the movie Unacknowledged. So all you have to do is, get the DVDs available at our website, get one, and invite people to come. When you do, you'll be shocked at how many people are interested in this. So it needs to be very much grassroots. We need people to actually get involved. And then at a sort of, let's say, a more senior level of society, we need to find people who can network the funding for the energy research projects and also educate the world's leaders on how important these issues are to what their heartfelt objectives are. I mean, many of them are very sincere in wanting to create a world that is abundant, that is cleaner, and that has a peaceful world and social justice, so there's not so much poverty, et cetera. But they don't have the tools. They need to be educated that the sciences and technologies that are in these unacknowledged special access projects and that have been viciously suppressed for the better part of a century are the key to opening that future. And so that is a very direct educational message that has to be conveyed to folks. And people just need to take the initiative and do it. I mean, I can only do so much personally, as can you. So we need a whole legion of people doing this all over the world.
Like you, for me, I've been carrying this burden of knowing what this game is about, at least the pieces that I know about from being in the industry, in the complex, and complex is the right word for it, for sure, the military industrial lab, university, intelligence community, NASA and other international space agencies, government's complex is what I generally call it. And it includes much more than that because, as you're describing, it's from the roots to the senior people around the youth to the mature people who have experienced patterns that have been going on, and the frequencies have been in a very low state of consciousness. So what you're doing, Steven, that I so appreciate, and I'm glad to share with people, is raising people's consciousness into a higher frequency. Could you address that?
Well, I think this is really one of the key things that we do is before I was a medical doctor, I was a meditation teacher, and I learned the Vedas and Sanskrit and meditation, and I began to have this understanding that the human individual is actually plugged into, let's call it, a universal field of consciousness and the cosmic mind, if you will, that is amazing, and that when people tap into that, they then have an effect that's 100-fold more than if they're not aware of it. So I think that the human potential is so huge, and the possibilities for enlightenment are very great. One of the things I do when I take people on these week-long expeditions under the stars, we're about to do one in the hill country of Texas next week, is I teach them these techniques of meditation and also remote viewing, and how our consciousness and mind can create a reality. And that in the truth is, this is wonderful saying, that Erwin Schrödinger, the father of modern quantum mechanics and particle wave theory, said the total number of minds in the universe is one. It's a singularity. So the true singularity is not artificial intelligence. It's this unbounded universal cosmic intelligence that can raise people's awareness into a state where they are much more powerful in what they're doing than if they're in a state of relative unconsciousness or normal human material consciousness alone or body consciousness. And this is something that everyone can experience. It has nothing to do with organized religion. In fact, organized religion drags people in the opposite direction for the most part. And I think that people have to begin to understand the power they have within themselves to create that reality and how that can then be a fulcrum for making change happen in the world. So I have actually an MP3 and a CD, and also in this app that teaches people about the CE5 contact protocols. There's an entire training program on meditation and remote viewing in that app that you can get from, iTunes Store or Android or whatever. And so I tell people that, and by the way, we've had people get that and who have had amazing cosmic consciousness experiences in contact with real ET that have manifested out as their properties, who have never met me personally, and all they've done is just use the app. So I tell people that this is something everyone can do, and you're really limited by your own imagination.
And this is something that we can also, as individuals, take to our leaders. Get this to the decision makers. Don't give up on this, because what Steven's talking about, what I hear you talking about, is actually it's an empowering of the individual, but it's not in the old ways. We've sat around and self-actualized for so many years. No, this is about not being seduced by scripts, becoming aware of the fact that we can think and we can create new realities that are magical and beautiful. And we have so many problems on the planet, we really must do this now. And we are in the extinction process. So there are many places people can jump in, whatever they're interested in, and apply that cosmic consciousness. It's a way, isn't it, Stephen, of rising above the way we used to think and getting our leaders to be there too, our decision makers, because we're our own leaders.
Well, yes, and if you look at the physics behind this, there is an effect that happens that is non-local. In other words, sort of like the 100th monkey effect, that once a certain number of people begin to do something because of the integrative nature of consciousness, other people spontaneously begin to do the same thing and awaken to the same reality. So there is a huge power in thousands and then millions of people understanding this dynamic of how consciousness is not limited to space and time. And there's a wonderful old Sufi saying that says, thinkest thyself a puny form when within thee the universe is folded. The rhetorical question. And basically what that means is the entirety of the universe is folded like a hologram in each and every individual. And that once we understand that and we begin to act, it actually opens up that possibility to our family, friends, neighbors, and people we may not even know because of the non-local effect, the fact that consciousness isn't limited in space and time. And here they've done biological studies where they've taken saliva from one person and with the white blood cells and flown them to Hawaii thousands of miles away. And when that person experiences a certain emotion, there's an electromagnetic impulse across the cellular membrane of those white cells, even though it's out of their body in a petri dish in Hawaii, and the person is living in New York. So we are wired into this non-locality. It's not a straight line universe. We've been miseducated on this. And once we understand the real nature, the true nature of ourselves and the cosmos, then we can open up all these possibilities that can happen very quickly.
And how do you deal with the people who may drag you down, try to discredit you, even harm you for talking this way, make you look like you're crazy, or bring down your own energy level in some cases?
Look, you ignore them. Here's the thing. What I've learned to do, I don't take the bait from the naysayers and the people who are always trying to defame me. And number two, you have to have enough knowledge within yourself that your ego is stable enough that you're not going to be thrown off base because someone goes, nah, boo-boo, stick your head in doo-doo. I mean, what are we, in kindergarten? So I tell people, I said, people like that are always going to be out there. You just, you just basically keep going forward and don't let them affect you. And it's like Winston Churchill said, never, never, never give up. You just keep going and keep, persevering. I think that most people, unfortunately, we've been trained to all be like we're in high school or middle school where we're looking at our peerage and worried someone will laugh at us. Guess what? Get over it. Be an adult. Do what you know is true and is right, and don't worry what other people say or think. Do the right thing regardless of what other people say or think. That's what I've done. And, it bothers people because people are always trying to throw red meat out to me to get me upset. It doesn't upset me because I know who I am. And everyone should discover who they are, have a deep confidence in that and faith in themselves and go forward and not be worried about what small-minded buffoons might say or do.
There was a series that was canceled. I think they're going to show, because of the huge outcry, an update, one version after the first of the year called Sense8. And it was about clusters that were forming, and they were telepathically connected around the world. Do you feel that there is that energy?
Well, I don't know that particular program. I do know for a fact that when we do our contact and CE5 protocols and everyone's doing these meditation and remote viewing programs, people, have experiences that is very empowering. And so there is this field. And by the way, the physics behind this, the science behind it is very solid. I mean, all the way from, random number generators at Princeton University with Dr. John, to the work that Dean Reed and others have done, and of course Edgar Mitchell did with Noetic Sciences. So yes, we can all do this, and the more that we do it, the easier it is for everyone else around us to do it. It creates its own momentum.
Thank you, Steven Greer.
Of 1991. And it came to me from a very good source, and it had the correct numbers on it. So I gave this document in a briefing prior to my meeting personally with astronaut Edgar Mitchell. I brought him as a guest so he could learn about this. He was just really exploring this back in those days. This is 20 years ago. And the Admiral, when he got this briefing packet, now keep in mind, this is the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Pentagon. He made inquiries into one of the compartmented operations, and these are top secret TSSCI, top secret special compartmented information, but in an unacknowledged area, meaning that it's not acknowledged as existing to anyone who is not in the system. And when he made this inquiry, he did locate, in fact, the correct compartment, but the people at the other end, who were contractors, corporate, said to him, yes, sir, we know who you are, but you don't have a need to know, and we cannot discuss this with you. Now, again, this is the head of intelligence of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an admiral. And he said, well, God damn it, if I don't have a need to know, who does? And they said, sir, we will not discuss this with you. And they hung up the phone on him. So by the time astronaut Edgar Mitchell and I and my military advisors got to this meeting with with Admiral Wilson, he was both terrified and confounded that this was the structure. And he, of course, had known about various unacknowledged special access projects. But this issue, the extraterrestrial and UFO issue, is the crown jewel of all the compartmented, black, unacknowledged special access projects. So people have this very incorrect idea that because you're the president of the United States or this general or this admiral or this CIA director, you're going to have an all-access pass to all these various compartments. That simply is false. And that's one of the things we establish in the movie Unacknowledged. Now, the second thing to understand is that from people I've worked with for many years, some of these people I've known for 25 years, quarter of a century, who have been in unacknowledged special access projects, the way the secrecy is enforced is so extraordinary. One man told me about one project he was in, and this was a very long time ago, I think in the 80s. And that one project was a $3 billion U.S. dollar project that was unacknowledged. They were taken into a underground SCIF, a secure communication information facility or intelligence facility. They had all of their guns and all of their electronics and watches, everything taken from them. And there was one man who went down who was the security officer for this particular USAP, Unacknowledged Special Access Project. That security officer, when he got all the people in the room working on that particular operation, pulled his magazine out of his gun, pulled a bullet out, and he said, "This bullet will find you if you discuss this with anyone not in this room. It doesn't matter if it's your commanding general. It doesn't matter if it's the President of the United States or the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, et cetera, and so on." So the public, and in fact, I would say government officials, both in the United States and elsewhere, need to understand the architecture and the structure of the secrecy. It is not the same as, say, the nuclear launch code or the routine things that, for example, that Snowden exposed in his leaks about the National Security Agency, a PRISM project. This is orders of magnitude beyond that. Now, I want to add another layer of complexity because I have been talking about unacknowledged special access projects within the government. Those interface very intimately with the top tier government contractors. Lockheed Martin Skunk Works, where they make all the super secret aircraft, Northrop Grumman, some of the Boeing operations, MITRE Corporation, EG&G, E-Systems, Raytheon, et cetera, and so on. Booz Allen Hamilton, what have you. Those operations are also unacknowledged special access projects, but they are also private proprietary corporate projects. And they have a dual level of secrecy because they will then claim that some of what they're working on is work product that is proprietary and therefore cannot be disclosed to people who try to investigate it. I talked to a man who was a Big Four accounting investigator who does audits of government contracts. And he ran into this operation at Northrop Grumman where basically they said, "We're not going to tell you anything about what we're actually doing with these funds. Here's what you can report."
Entrepreneurial anywhere where people are really serious about the UFO issue, especially in the United States where we are.
Well, I think that the first thing we have to do is establish there are at least two trajectories that deal with this issue. The government that people mostly think about, we elect or get appointed, they have very little exposure to this issue, if any. Now, we've just come out with a documentary called Unacknowledged, which has been pretty much in the top documentary on iTunes since May, and it's now on Netflix as, I think, in the top 2 or 3 globally. And I recommend people see this as sort of an introduction to the issue. And the name of the film, Unacknowledged, comes from the proper name for unacknowledged special access projects, or USAPs, that are the super secret projects that are beyond constitutional oversight and control. And we estimate upwards of around $200 billion a year clandestinely are going into these unacknowledged special access projects. And over the last few decades, somewhere around $8.5 trillion have been siphoned off into these operations. Now, to understand the structure of this is really the first step. Otherwise, nothing we're going to say for the next 2 hours is going to make any sense to anybody. So I like to give examples so that people have a very palpable sense of this. And I remember some years ago, before I did the Global Disclosure Project National Press Club that you graciously agreed to attend and provide your testimony, I was asked to brief the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, J2, it would be called in the United States. Now, this was an admiral, Tom Wilson, who had received from us a detailed briefing an updated version of what I provided to President Bill Clinton and his CIA director, Jim Woolsey. And that briefing actually had a document that I had recently acquired that was from the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, which is the super secret spy satellite entity that has spy satellites up in space, some of which, of course, are movable and can be repositioned. At any rate, this document lists the project code names and numbers for a number of these projects as of
My pleasure, my honor really, to have our special guest today, Dr. Steven Greer. The show will be aired on September 15th and replayed several times because of the rare importance of this particular show, as it's going to be a briefing for many scientists, pilots, people in all kinds of positions that are related to the UFO issue and various anomalies. And because of the current situation, as this world, many of us know, is approaching a very dangerous border time between life and death, extinction and possibilities. If it wasn't for Dr. Greer, I would not even be talking with you right now, as he and his wife Emily have invited me to the Disclosure Project, where I was exposed to people, experts in all fields related, who knew more than I did and what I do about this UFO issue, most of which I have kept quiet due to what I know Dr. Greer has experienced too, the different threats, discrediting campaigns, and so on. Today we're going to bring out a new kind of truth that's dealing with the insider information about this UFO issue, about what's actually going on, who's doing it, not just at the amateur level, but in the departmental government research and the phenomena of UFOs in general across the entire span around the world. Dr. Greer, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you.
Thank you. No one on the earth has done more than you have that I know of. I know you are famous for having delved into so many areas of the UFO issue. I've received a lot of questions from some people who are interested in causing the pivot that your work has led to, the change that might be possible on this planet if people understood and knew what you do and what you have been experiencing, the people that you've met, the enormous amounts of information that you've collected that I've even seen in your home. And for the sake of the children, and I know you have 4 and 8 grandchildren, and I have close to 500 million orphans now, the way I look at it, with 100 to 200 species of animals disappearing every day. This is really a time of crisis. And so to relate this issue to the leadership, the decision makers, and to the people who might be able to do something about it is what I see this program doing. So I'd like to begin with what is going on in the USA. This is one of the big questions that's come to me from the international experts. What's actually going on in different departments, in governmental, corporate.
And he just had to rubber stamp it. So there's really no oversight of this. This is a very complex structure that people have to understand is not your normal appropriations, oversight, etc. I can't tell you how many members of Congress, for example, and also leaders in other countries I've spoken to, who every person listening on the show would think that they certainly would know about anything this sensitive. And I can assure you they do not. So the first thing you have to get your mind around is from 1945, at the end of World War II, until now, there evolved, and most of this took place in the 50s, by the way, and 60s, a classification of operations that are literally beyond what most people would think top secret and are in these unacknowledged special access projects. These are facts. This is what we can prove through testimony, and which if you go to our website, which is SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS, like the star system, disclosure.com, there's a link to dozens and dozens of these people's testimony, documents, etc. Now, because of that, people who are in the know, for example, in government or even corporations that I've met with, will frequently tell me, well, I had access to everything but this area, but I knew it was going on. I'll give you an example. I once had a a meeting with the former chairman of AT&T and also the man who had been the chairman of Stanford Research International, SRI. They knew that they had operations, contract operations within their organizations dealing with the UFO and extraterrestrial issue, and particularly the technologies. But because even though they were the chairman or CEOs of these, they were not read into it. Read into means briefed. So it's incredibly tightly compartmentalized. It's not the normal top-down structure that you think of when you think of governance in either civilian government, military intelligence, or corporate governance. And I think this is the thing that most people have to first get a reset on their understanding. Then the rest of what I'm going to tell you makes sense. For example, that once we began to study the objects that did come from Roswell that were extraterrestrial in origin, but also many others. And unfortunately, these were extraterrestrial vehicles that were surveilling our nuclear